Hey there! Welcome to Canada's era of madness, when there seemed to be a real boom in insane asylums from the 1800s to early 1900s. Psychiatry during the Victorian era is a huge controversial subject. I don't even want to go there. The intent of this video is not to focus on the practice of psychiatry, but to take a look at the buildings from Victorian Canada. I'm going to show you some of what I found. Over 20 insane asylums across Canada, and almost half of them in Ontario alone. The first thing that struck me about all this was, what was going on? What was happening back then that they needed so many asylums? So I guess I will have to touch on the people aspect, but I'll do so briefly. We've all seen period movies where a family member is hidden away in an upstairs room or sent away because they're quote-unquote different. There was such a stigma against any kind of mental illness. While researching, I came across an article in the Toronto Star from 2017. I'm not going to share it here because I don't want to infringe on any copyrights. You can search for it yourself, but the article describes how as recently as the 1950s, people on the streetcar that drove in front of the insane asylum would hold their breath so they wouldn't catch any fumes of mental illness. I also came across a lot of material that describes how in the 1800s, people suffering from any kind of mental affliction were locked away in jails. Some of them spent years there. Years. Overcrowding was a huge problem, but there never seems to have been any money or real motivation to help. But from what I read, it looks like funds did start to become available in the early 1800s. And it looks like architects and builders went mad. Since I mentioned Toronto's daily newspaper, let's start there. This is the provincial asylum that opened in that city in 1850. Look at it, it's huge! Toronto's population was only about 30,000 people when it opened. Half the city could have lived there. Why did they need to build something so massive? It's not as if it's the only asylum that opened in Ontario. Don't get me wrong, patients deserve the best possible care in the best possible conditions. But how did they go from dumping people into jails to something as imposing and old-world majestic as this? Would Toronto even have had the labor force and resources to build something like that? To put this building into perspective, here's a drawing of the Toronto Fish Market a few years before the asylum opened. We're talking the age of horse and buggy, manual labor, carrying water, chopping wood. How long would it take to build the thing? I came across one article that describes the laying of the cornerstone on August 22, 1846. That means they built it in 4 years. No heavy equipment, no excavators, no power tools. How is that possible? I found another article that says the asylum was only half built when it opened. Even then, it would take more than 4 years just to excavate the site if all you're using is shovels, pickaxes, horses and wagons. And think of all the wood, the bricks, the stones, cement, nails, windows, and everything else they would need to get the place up and running. Where would they get it all? One site I visited describes what Toronto, then called York, was like during those early years. By 1832, York had displaced Kingston as Upper Canada's leading town, with an economy based on serving a rising hinterland as lumbermen and settlers cleared the forests and transformed the colonial landscape. Industrial output remained modest in the provincial capital during those years, with few operations expanding beyond workshop enterprises to meet local needs. Looks like people were really busy carving a nation out of the wilderness. So how would they have the wherewithal to build something as grand as this? I'm sorry, but there's a major disconnect between the two. Here's a photo of the Protestant Insane Asylum in Verdun, Montreal, in 1890. Check out the buildings in the foreground. Now that looks more like the types of buildings you'd expect to see. But again, why? Why did they need to build such a huge asylum? What was going on? What was happening to the wholesome farming folk that so many people wound up in an asylum? Why were huge institutions like this popping up all over the place? I can't get over all the turrets and cupolas. What could they possibly contribute to patient care? History always tells us there was a constant lack of funding. Every penny was a struggle. Why would they build huge castles for people that society in general couldn't care less about and would rather forget? Maybe they thought differently back then, but I can see many better ways they could have used all those resources. And they had a fountain. In fact, I noticed a few of them had fountains. Not that there's anything wrong with having a fountain, they're very calming, but weren't public works like water systems and sewers just starting to show up and only in major urban centers at that time? So if that's the case, how'd they run a fountain if all they had was a well? And check out this landscaping. Actually, it's really, really impressive. But how, and more importantly, why? Why would they do this? Was it part of patient enrichment? I tried to find information about the actual construction. I wanted to know why the powers that be would be so extravagant and I dare say frivolous when money and resources were so hard to come by. Unfortunately, I didn't get much farther than the year the asylums opened. Maybe I wasn't researching this right. I don't know. Sometimes sources would just say the building was constructed the same year that it opened. Does this mean it would have been built in a year? Really? What would they do? Empty the entire town and get everybody to work on construction? If so, who would be left behind to chop wood, plow the fields, go hunting, keep the fire going so they could stay warm and boil a kettle? When it comes to researching historic buildings, I also come across the word founded. What does that even mean, founded? Makes me think of Hansel and Gretel wandering, lost in the woods, and finding that gingerbread house. Hey, let's just put all the crazy people in here. I find all this so very, very intriguing, and I'm sure there's way more out there waiting to be found. So many asylums, so many way oversized, way over the top asylums. Why? None of this adds up, at least not for me. And whenever I go digging for answers, all I seem to find are more questions. But don't take my word for it. Always do your own research and see what you come up with. After all, I could be completely wrong about all of this. Then again, I may be right.